those two facts, I think, are the most important things to know if you know anything about our state tax code. And this all goes back to the 1930s. So, for the first 50 years of the state's colonial history, or rather, like history after colonization, um, the state tax code was largely reliant on property taxes. And that was because the way most people held wealth in the state was in the form of large farms. And therefore, a tax on property was a fairly reasonable way to tax the wealth that existed in the state. Over the course of the 50 years from the 1880s to the 1930s, cities sprang up, including Seattle, where I live, along the Sound and mostly in the western part of the state, and a more financialized economy emerged that wasn't as reliant on property and was much more reliant on income for generating wealth. Um, Pair that growing situation where there was this large amount of income being generated and not being taxed with the Great Depression kicking off in 1929. And by the early 1930s, you had a situation where the property tax base was collapsing. And also, the folks, largely landowners in the eastern part of the state who were carrying the burden of the state's tax structure, started feeling like it would be really great if we taxed, for example, the bankers in Seattle instead of them. And so there was a large, really mass popular movement to introduce a state income tax, and not only a state personal income tax, but a state corporate income tax. And both of these were put in place by the people of this state. Unfortunately, shortly after they were put in place, the state Supreme Court struck down that income tax and that corporate income tax on the basis of the decision that income was property, and property based on the state constitution has to be taxed at a uniform rate. So they struck down both of these income taxes. More on that later. This left the legislature in a huge problem because they didn't have the property tax revenue, but they also didn't have the income tax revenue that they've been counting on. And so, in one legislative session in 1935, we basically built the state tax code we have today, which is a gross receipts tax on business called the B&O tax, a sales tax across a wide range of largely goods at that point, but now goods and services. And yes, that's still that property tax. And that tax code, which was intended to be a temporary stopgap until they figured out how to get the income tax back, is basically the tax code we had up until this year.